October 1944, Leyte Island, Philippines. General MacArthur's Operation King II launched the reconquest of the Philippine archipelago with massive American troop landings. Japanese forces under General Yamashita fought back fiercely from fortified positions hidden among mangroves and hills, turning every American advance into a bloody struggle. The first grenade exploded 20 meters from the medical tent, covering everything in mud and metal. Fragments. Dr. William Carter didn't even lift his eyes. From the makeshift table where he was suturing a Marine's abdomen, his hands stayed steady as the second blast shook the swampy ground. Combat medics braved exploding shells was no dramatic headline. It was the raw reality of men sworn to save lives while death reigned from the Philippine sky. Paul Reynolds ran through the smoking craters carrying another wounded soldier, ignoring the shards whistling past his head. War had turned doctors into warriors of life. The forward medical post had been set up in a muddy clearing, surrounded by shattered palm trees and the constant echo of Japanese artillery rumbling through the hills of Leyte. Dr. William Carter surveyed the rain-soaked ground where his team had pitched the canvas, tents that would serve as an emergency hospital. Each step sank into tropical mud mixed with rainwater and dark stains no one dared identify. The acrid smell of burnt gunpowder clung to the humid air, competing with the sweet, nauseating scent of rotting mangrove vegetation. Distant explosions made the tent flap shudder again and again, a constant reminder that the front line was dangerously close. Carter adjusted the stethoscope around his neck and drew a deep breath, knowing the next few days would test not only his medical skill, but his courage to stand firm when death came hunting. The Hippocratic Oath never mentioned bullets whining over a surgeon's head, but here he was, ready to honor it all the same. The first warning siren wailed in the distance, announcing the arrival of the morning's first casualties from the assault on the Japanese entrenchments in the hills. Sergeant Medic Paul Reynolds checked the contents of his field kit for the third time, arranging morphine, bandages and blood plasma with the precision of someone who knew that seconds could decide whether a soldier made it home or stayed forever in those Philippine mangroves. His calloused fingers slid over each item, memorizing their positions. Under enemy fire, there would be no time to search for gear. The growl of approaching evacuation jeeps mingled with the cries of the wounded, creating a macabre symphony that would become the soundtrack of the days ahead. Reynolds had served in Italy and France, but the stifling Philippine heat added a layer of torment to every rescue. Sweat poured constantly beneath his helmet, fogging his vision at the worst moments. He watched young Marines being lifted from stretchers, some conscious enough to moan in pain, others ominously silent. He had been just 22 when he enlisted. Now, at 25, he felt like a veteran who had already seen enough of humanity to fill 3 lifetimes. Yet every wounded man he managed to stabilize and send to the hospital ships was a small victory against the surrounding hell. Nurse Mary Delgado improvised a surgical table from 2 empty ammunition crates and a door torn from a wrecked Filipino hut, covering it with sheets she had somehow kept relatively clean despite the brutal conditions. Her experienced hands laid out basic surgical instruments beneath the flickering light of kerosene lanterns, knowing demand would soon far outstrip their limited resources. The thump of nearby mortar shells made medicine bottles clink constantly on the makeshift shelves, creating a war music she had learned to ignore. Delgado had volunteered for Pacific duty after losing her brother at Guadalcanal. Every soldier she treated carried a trace of Tommy's face, the boy who used to steal cookies from their mother's kitchen in Chicago. Mud clung to her nurse's boots, making every step heavy, but she had learned to work in conditions that would make any civilian hospital seem like a palace. When the first serious casualty arrived, a boy of no more than 19 with shrapnel in his chest, she didn't hesitate to clasp his hand while Carter prepared the improvised anesthesia. Humanity had to be preserved, even as barbarity reigned around them. Corporal Frank Hughes had been hit by grenade fragments when his unit tried to seize a Japanese fortified hill, the bunkers hidden in thick tropical growth. The blast flung him into a muddy crater, where he lay semi-conscious for 2 hours, hearing the fierce gunfire above as his life bled away with the blood soaking his uniform. When Reynolds finally found him, Hughes was delirious, talking to his father about the Iowa corn harvest he would never see. The medic carried him on his back across 400 meters of swampy ground under sniper fire, pausing 3 times to shelter behind fallen logs, while Japanese bullets whistled dangerously close. Hughes represented thousands of other young Americans who had left farms, factories, and universities to fight a war that seemed endless, in a land most couldn't have found on a map before enlisting. His abdominal wound bled heavily, but his eyes still shone with the stubborn determination that marked soldiers of the American Midwest. As Carter examined his injuries by the weak lantern light, Hughes murmured that he didn't want to die so far from home, a plea that echoed in the hearts of everyone present. His survival would become a symbol of the combat medic's skill and devotion. The first hours of the Lady medical operation set the brutal rhythm that would dominate the days to come. Waves of wounded arriving as Japanese artillery continually tested the courage of those sworn to save lives. Carter felt like the conductor of a macabre orchestra, where each instrument was a human life in danger, and his baton was a scalpel that had to cut with precision even when his hands trembled from exhaustion. The smell of ether mingled with gunpowder, turning the Philippine mangrove into a tropical version of hell, where angels in military uniforms fought invisible demons armed with mortars and machine guns. Reynolds developed a triage system to save as many soldiers as possible, making impossible choices about who had a chance to live and who was beyond human help. Delgado found that her gentle voice could calm even the most desperate wounded, turning simple words into emotional morphine that complemented the scarce physical painkillers. Hughes, half-conscious on the improvised table, became their first true test. If they could save him, they would prove it was possible to beat death even in the worst conditions. The war had begun for the medical team, but they would fight with instruments of healing against an enemy, armed for destruction. The opening chapter of their medical battle ended with a silent vow. No American soldier would die for lack of care, while they were alive to prevent it. The second wave of wounded arrived as the sun began to set over Leyte, painting the sky in a red watercolor that mirrored the earthly violence unfolding in the drenched mangroves. Carter had just stabilized Hughes when 3 military jeeps rolled into the clearing, carrying 6 soldiers in various states of injury, 2 unconscious, 1 screaming uncontrollably, the other 3 staring with the empty look of traumatic shock. The sound of Japanese grenades had intensified, suggesting the enemy had roughly located the medical post and was testing their aim with increasingly accurate fire. Delgado rushed to help unload the wounded, her boots sinking into mud now mixed with clotted blood and shards of shattered equipment scattered across the area. The kerosene lantern flickered dangerously with each nearby blast, casting dancing shadows that turned the medical scene into a grim theater where life and death contested every patient. Reynolds quickly checked each newcomer's pulse, applying improvised tourniquets and morphine injections with the efficiency of a finely tuned machine trained to function under extreme pressure. The sticky texture of the tropical mud coated everything: tools, bandages, hands, creating working conditions that would challenge even the most experienced medical professionals in peacetime. Carter drew a deep breath, adjusted the lantern, and plunged into the work that would define not only these men's fates, but his own soul as a doctor tested in the fire of war. The first emergency surgery unfolded beneath the deafening thunder of a mortar barrage that made the entire team duck instinctively, except Carter, who kept his hands steady over the open abdomen of an infantryman ripped by shrapnel. The acrid scent of burnt gunpowder mingled with the metallic odor of fresh blood, searing the nostrils and turning every breath into a reminder of death's nearness. Delgado held the lantern in one hand and used the other to wipe the sweat from Carter's brow, allowing him to focus as he located and removed the metal fragments that had pierced vital organs. The patient, a boy barely 20 from Alabama, murmured his mother's name under the effects of improvised anesthesia, his words lost in the constant roar of artillery that had turned the Philippine night into a symphony of destruction. Reynolds organized a medical assembly line, where each casualty was quickly assessed, treated according to severity, and readied for evacuation or emergency surgery, a brutal but necessary system to maximize survival. Everyone's hands were constantly coated with a slippery mixture of blood, mud, and antiseptic that made handling delicate instruments a struggle. Carter finished the first surgery just as a particularly close explosion showered dirt and debris over the improvised table. But the soldier was alive and stabilized, a small victory against the forces trying to turn the mangrove into a graveyard. Reynolds's triage system proved vital when the third wave of wounded arrived at the same time as the most intense bombardment they had yet faced. Successive explosions lit the clearing with orange flashes that rivaled the kerosene lanterns, creating a terrifying spectacle that tested even seasoned veterans' nerves. Delgado discovered she could stay calm by softly humming the lullabies her Italian grandmother used to sing in Chicago, turning childhood melodies into emotional anchors that kept her from succumbing to the collective panic. The smell of ether and chloroform began to outweigh the gunpowder, a sign that surgeries were multiplying faster than the small medical team could handle. Hughes, still on the main operating table, had regained enough consciousness to watch the chaos around him, his eyes reflecting a mix of gratitude and horror as he grasped the magnitude of the sacrifice these medics were making for him and the others. The mud had turned into a reddish paste that clung to boots and made every movement harder, but no one complained. Total concentration was required to maintain the life-saving pace the situation demanded. Reynolds developed an almost uncanny instinct for identifying which wounded had real chances of survival, making choices that would save the greatest number of American soldiers, even when those choices were morally devastating. War had turned medics into generals commanding battles against death, wielding scalpels and morphine as weapons in a campaign where every life saved was territory reclaimed from destruction. The fourth surgery of the night revealed the full measure of their dedication when Carter operated on a soldier with severe abdominal wounds as grenade fragments rained onto the tent, punching holes that let in the tropical downpour that had begun. Delgado improvised an umbrella from a curved piece of metal to shield the surgical field, keeping instruments and patient relatively dry while the storm turned the mangrove into a muddy lagoon. The sound of rain beating on the torn canvas created a hypnotic rhythm that mingled with the groans of the wounded and the distant explosions, composing a surreal soundtrack for the human drama unfolding in that remote Philippine clearing. Reynolds moved constantly among patients, applying tourniquets, checking vital signs and reshuffling priorities as new casualties arrived. His energy seemed inexhaustible, fueled by adrenaline and the sense of duty that had made him a life-saving machine. The rain-softened mud grew slick and treacherous, making the delicate precision of medical procedures even harder. Hughes watched it all with rising awe, realizing he was witnessing something extraordinary. Ordinary men and women transformed by war into heroes who faced death to preserve life. The smell of blood, ether, and tropical mud formed a unique aroma that would forever burn itself into everyone's memory, a reminder of the price of freedom and the courage required to defend it. Carter completed the surgery at the very moment a violent blast blew out all the lanterns, plunging the medical post into total darkness. But the soldier was alive, breathing and stabilized on the improvised table that had become an altar, where humanity celebrated its greatest victories over the forces of destruction. Dawn brought a brief lull in the shelling, allowing the medical team to assess the results of their first full night of operations under extreme combat conditions. 15 soldiers had passed across the improvised tables, 12 stabilized and sent to the hospital ships, 2 lost despite every effort, and 1, Hughes, still under intensive observation on the main table. Carter looked at his own hands, trembling with exhaustion, and stained with a mixture of dried blood and mud that seemed to have become part of his skin, reminding him he had crossed an invisible line between civilian doctor and warrior of life. Delgado organized the remaining supplies, noting that morphine was running dangerously low, and that they would have to improvise pain relief with medicinal alcohol and psychological distraction for the next casualties. Reynolds cleaned his rescue equipment with the care of a craftsman tending precious tools, knowing each item could mean the difference between life and death in the hours ahead. The smell of disinfectant couldn't fully mask the lingering odor of death over the mangrove, reminding them all that they were operating on the razor's edge between hope and despair. Hughes had become a symbol of resilience. His survival proved that even in the worst conditions, It was possible to overcome devastating wounds, inspiring the team to keep fighting against seemingly impossible odds. The first night was over, but everyone knew it was only the beginning of a medical battle that would test not just their technical skills, but their ability to keep humanity alive when barbarity tried to extinguish it. The rising sun over Leyte lit weary yet determined faces, men and women who had discovered reserves of courage they never knew they possessed, ready to face whatever the new day would bring in that mangrove-turned battlefield between life and death. The sun rose over Leyte, revealing the devastation left by the first night of intense medical operations. Smoldering craters dotted the clearing around the forward post. Twisted shards of metal gleamed among the shredded tropical vegetation, and dark stains in the mud told the silent story of the price paid for every life saved. Carter checked Hughes for the 5th time since sunrise, confirming vital signs that remained stable. Despite the harsh conditions, the young soldier from Iowa had become living, proof that combat medicine could overcome even the gravest wounds when applied with determination and skill. The smell of military coffee boiling in an improvised tin mingled with the lingering sense of gunpowder and disinfectant, creating an aroma that would forever be tied to those dramatic days in the Philippine mangroves. Delgado handed out the last rations to the wounded awaiting evacuation, turning each sip of water and every piece of biscuit into a small celebration of life still beating, despite the violence around them. Reynolds tested communication equipment, hoping to establish contact with other medical units, knowing coordination would be essential to handle the growing waves of casualties that were sure to come. The mud had hardened slightly under the morning sun, making movement easier, yet it still clung to boots as a constant reminder of the precarious conditions they worked in. The morning's relative quiet was deceiving. Everyone knew it was merely the calm before a storm even more violent, one that would break as American troops pushed deeper into the hills. The first emergency of the day arrived before the coffee had cooled. A military jeep rolled into the clearing carrying 4 Marines, wounded in a Japanese ambush that had decimated a reconnaissance patrol sent to map enemy positions in the surrounding hills. The most critical was a sergeant from Detroit, who had lost massive amounts of blood to leg wounds caused by a homemade landmine, his glassy eyes reflecting the traumatic shock that accompanies severe hemorrhage. Carter moved immediately to the surgical table, his hands still trembling from exhaustion but steady enough to perform the necessary procedures. The experience of the previous night had forged a confidence that transcended physical fatigue. Delgado prepared blood plasma with precise movements, knowing every minute lost lowered the chance of saving the Marine who murmured about a fiancée named Susan and an engagement ring tucked into his shirt pocket. The distant sound of artillery gradually grew louder, suggesting a new offensive was being prepared, and that more wounded would soon arrive at the forward medical post. Reynolds coordinated the evacuation of stabilized patients while clearing space for new cases, developing a wartime logistics system that maximized efficiency even with extremely limited resources. Smoke from grenades exploding in the hills formed an acrid haze that stung the eyes and made breathing difficult, but no one complained. Absolute concentration was essential to keep up the life-saving pace. Carter worked for 2 hours on the Marine from Detroit, removing metal fragments and reconstructing damaged blood vessels in a display of surgical skill, impressive even in a well-equipped peacetime hospital. Hughes regained enough consciousness to speak for the first time since his arrival. His first words a question about his fellow soldiers who had joined the assault on the Japanese position, where he'd been wounded. Delgado held his hand as she gently explained that he was the sole survivor of his squad, watching how the news brought a mix of relief at being alive and guilt for having survived when others had not. The young soldier began to cry silently, not from the physical pain, now under control, but from the emotional pain of knowing he would never again see the familiar faces of comrades with whom he had shared trenches and rations through months of campaigning. Carter paused to talk with Hughes, explaining that his survival honored the memory of the fallen, and that he would have the chance to return to his Iowa farm to carry on the life they no longer could. The scent of medicine and blood that permeated the medical post seemed less oppressive when tempered by moments of humanity like this. reminding everyone why they fought death under such brutal conditions. Reynolds watched the conversation from a distance, recognizing the therapeutic importance of giving meaning to the wounded suffering. Healing the body was only half the job of a combat medic. The coarse texture of clean bandages contrasted with the softness of Delgado's hands as she adjusted Hughes's dressings, showing how small gestures of care could convey hope, even in the most desperate circumstances. Hughes's recovery became a symbol of hope for the entire team, proving it was possible not only to save lives, but to help the wounded find meaning in their survival. By midday came news that a major American offensive was being prepared for the coming hours, meaning the forward medical post had to brace for the largest wave of casualties since its setup in the Leyte mangroves. Carter gathered his team to plan strategies that would let them treat as many soldiers as possible with the limited resources and every decision could mean the difference between life and death for dozens of young Americans. Delgado organized triage stations to quickly classify the wounded by severity, creating a system of priorities that would maximize collective survival, even when it required painful individual choices. Reynolds tested evacuation routes and rescue points, identifying safe paths to retrieve the wounded, even under direct enemy fire. His quiet courage inspired the entire team to push beyond their own limits. The smell of food being prepared by military cooks mixed with the persistent scent of gunpowder, creating a surreal atmosphere where everyday life tried to hold on despite the proximity of violent death. Hughes insisted on helping with simple tasks despite his injuries, arranging bandages and medical supplies with the determination of someone who had found new purpose in survival. The metallic gleam of surgical instruments shone under the tropical sun, a reminder that they were weapons in a war against destruction, tools of life in a battle where death seemed to hold all the advantages. Carter looked around the improvised medical post and saw not just tents and makeshift equipment, but a bastion of humanity resisting barbarity, a place where doctors became warriors for life. The medical team had found its combat rhythm, developing a synchronicity that would allow them to face whatever challenges the afternoon might bring in that mangrove-turned battlefield between hope and despair. Preparing for the offensive revealed the true depth of the combat medic's commitment when Reynolds volunteered to accompany the assault troops, carrying basic first aid gear to treat the wounded directly on the battlefield. Carter initially resisted the idea, arguing that losing Reynolds would cut their rescue capacity in half, but the medic sergeant insisted that his presence on the front line could save soldiers who might die before reaching the medical post. Delgado supported the decision, offering to take on extra responsibilities to keep operations running, even with a reduced team. Her determination reflected the spirit of sacrifice that characterized every member of the medical unit. Hughes, still recovering but fully aware, asked to help coordinate communications, turning his experience as a wounded soldier into an advantage for directing the most efficient rescues. The smell of gun oil from freshly cleaned weapons mingled with the scent of antiseptics, creating an aroma that symbolized the union of soldiers and medics in a shared mission to preserve American lives. The rough texture of sweat-soaked military uniforms contrasted with the smoothness of clean dressings that would soon be used on the next battle's casualties, a reminder that war and healing walked side by side in those Philippine mangroves. Carter silently blessed each member of his team, recognizing that he commanded not just medics, but heroes who had chosen to confront death in order to defend life. The afternoon approached carrying both the promise of violence and the opportunity for salvation, once again testing the courage of men and women who had turned their medical vows into acts of war against destruction. Battle, where every life saved marked a victory of humanity over the forces that sought to destroy it. The offensive began with an artillery barrage that made the mangrove swamps ground quake, sending seismic waves that rocked the medical tents and made every carefully arranged surgical instrument rattle atop the improvised tables. Carter watched through the flap of the main tent as smoke columns rose from the hills, where American troops pushed against fortified Japanese positions, knowing each distant explosion might be injuring soldiers who would soon arrive at his aid station. Reynolds had gone out with the first assault wave, hauling his medic's pack across hostile ground where Japanese snipers hunted any American movement. his quiet courage embodying the best of military medicine under extreme conditions. The smell of cordite mixed with the sweet scent of scorched tropical vegetation, creating an acrid atmosphere that burned the nostrils and constantly reminded them how close the violence on the surrounding hills really was. Delgado set up additional emergency stations using empty ammunition crates and scraps of canvas salvaged from destroyed gear, turning the wreckage of war into life-saving tools with the creativity that marks medical professionals under extreme pressure. Hughes, still recovering but determined to contribute, organized an improvised communication system that would keep rescues and evacuations coordinated even if military phone lines were cut by enemy shelling. The sticky texture of tropical mud had worsened with rising humidity, creating working conditions that would challenge even the most seasoned surgeons in well-equipped peacetime hospitals. Carter took a deep breath, adjusted his stethoscope, and prepared to face the greatest test of his medical career, saving lives while war roared around him like a maddened beast trying to devour everything in its path. The first wounded from the offensive arrived in an avalanche of pain and blood that immediately stress-tested every system the medical team had set up during their hours of intense preparation. 3 military jeeps rolled into the clearing at once, carrying 9 soldiers in varying states of injury. 2 unconscious with head trauma, 3 with severe abdominal wounds, 1 with extensive burns from Japanese flamethrowers, and 3 more with multiple fractures from grenade blasts. Carter moved like a conductor leading an emergency orchestra, rapidly assessing each case and directing patients to different stations by severity and survival odds, making split-second decisions that would determine the fate of young men who had left American families to fight in a distant land. Delgado became a machine of medical efficiency, applying tourniquets, preparing blood plasma, and administering morphine with precise movements that saved precious seconds in the race against death, unfolding at every improvised table. The deafening artillery had intensified, a constant backdrop of explosions that made medical instruments vibrate and hampered communication among the team. Hughes coordinated the radios with a determination that transcended his physical limitations, directing new rescues and organizing evacuations with the precision of someone intimately familiar with the horrors of the battlefield. Smoke from nearby explosions created an acrid haze that stung the eyes and made breathing difficult. But no one stopped to complain. Total concentration was essential to maintain the life-saving tempo the desperate situation demanded. Carter began the first emergency surgery on a Marine from Boston, who had lost massive amounts of blood to mortar shrapnel, his hands working with millimetric precision, while blasts shook the ground surrounding the forward aid station. Reynolds's arrival carrying a gravely wounded soldier marked a moment of quiet heroism that would forever define combat medicine in the minds of everyone present. The medic sergeant had sprinted 400 meters across open ground under intense Japanese machine gun fire, carrying on his back a young lieutenant from Texas who had been hit by a sniper. While coordinating his unit's advance on a fortified position, Reynolds stumbled in covered with mud, sweat, and blood, some his, some the casualties, but with the officer still alive and conscious enough to mumble thanks for a rescue that had likely saved his life. The smell of burnt powder clung to Reynolds's uniform, mixing with the metallic tang of fresh blood in a combination that would forever be associated with courage in combat. Carter examined the injured lieutenant immediately and found that the bullet had pierced a lung but missed vital organs. A serious wound, yet treatable if operated on quickly, with the limited equipment available in the improvised medical post. Delgado readied the main surgical table as nearby blasts sent debris raining onto the tent, creating working conditions that would test even the most experienced medical professionals in modern hospitals. The rough texture of blood-soaked bandages contrasted with the gentleness of the practiced hands applying them, proof that humanity persisted even in the most brutal circumstances. Hughes watched Reynolds with growing admiration, recognizing in the medic sergeant the quiet courage that turns ordinary men into living legends of military medicine. The rescue proved that medical devotion could overcome even the fear of death, inspiring the whole team to keep fighting against seemingly impossible odds in that mangrove-turned battlefield between life and destruction. The day's most complex operation required Carter to perform emergency abdominal surgery, while fragments of Japanese grenades pattered onto the medical tent, punching holes that let in debris and the thick tropical damp. The patient was a corporal from Missouri, struck by multiple pieces of shrapnel, when his unit tried to flank a heavily defended Japanese position on bunker-studded hills. Carter worked with absolute focus, ignoring the blasts that shook the ground and made the kerosene lantern over the improvised field flicker dangerously. Delgado held instruments with one hand and shielded the patient from debris with the other, becoming a human barrier between the surgery and the destructive chaos roaring around the post. The smell of ether mixed with gunpowder created a surreal atmosphere that fought against concentration. But Carter kept his hands steady as he located and removed metal fragments that had pierced internal organs. Reynolds ran constantly among patients, checking vital signs and administering first aid, while coordinating new rescues through the communications system Hughes had rigged. The viscous mix of blood and tropical mud made delicate instruments slippery, but the team had developed techniques adapted to the adverse conditions that allowed them to maintain the necessary precision. Hughes coordinated evacuations with growing efficiency, his experience as a wounded soldier giving him valuable insight into patient needs at different stages of treatment. Carter finished the surgery at the exact moment a particularly violent blast briefly blew out all the lanterns. But the soldier from Missouri was stabilized and breathing. Another victory wrested from death's grasp in that improvised hospital in the Filipino inferno. Late afternoon brought a moment of reckoning when the medical team realized they had successfully treated 23 wounded soldiers during the most intense offensive they had faced so far, losing only 2 whose injuries were incompatible with life, even in perfectly equipped hospitals. Carter looked at his hands, trembling with fatigue and stained with dried blood and mud that seemed to have become a permanent part of his identity as a combat doctor, and recognized he had definitively crossed the line between civilian medicine and a war against death. Reynolds cleaned his rescue gear with the meticulous care of a craftsman tending sacred tools, each item representing lives saved and American families who would welcome their sons home instead of receiving condolence telegrams. Delgado organized the remaining medical supplies, noting they had used nearly all the morphine, but that creativity and dedication had made up for the scarcity of material resources. Hughes had become not just a symbol of survival, but an active member of the medical team, his experience as a wounded soldier offering unique perspectives on the needs of patients in combat. The smell of disinfectant could not fully mask the gunpowder that permeated everything, a constant reminder that they operated on the frontier between civilization and barbarity. The coarse feel of sweat-soaked uniforms contrasted with the softness of clean bandages prepared for the next casualties, symbolizing the eternal tension between destruction and healing that defines military medicine. Carter gathered his team for a brief moment of reflection, acknowledging they were witnessing and participating in something extraordinary, the transformation of ordinary human beings into silent heroes who face death to preserve life. The sun set over Lady, lighting tired but determined faces, men and women who had discovered reserves of courage and dedication beyond their own limits, ready to keep fighting, as long as American soldiers needed medical care in that mangrove turned sanctuary of humanity amid total war. Darkness settled over Leyte like a black cloak punctuated by the orange flashes of Japanese artillery, which continued to probe the American defenses established after a long day of intense combat. Carter had set up extra lanterns around the medical post, creating an island of golden light in the tropical night, an oasis that drew not only the wounded seeking salvation, but also the unwelcome attention of enemy snipers lurking in the surrounding mangroves. The smell of kerosene from the lanterns mingled with the persistent sense of gunpowder and blood, imprinting an atmosphere that would forever remain in the memory of all who took part in that extraordinary night of combat medicine. Reynolds had returned from his 3rd rescue mission of the day carrying an Air Force pilot who had been shot down over Japanese-controlled territory and had managed to crawl back to American lines despite severe leg wounds from the impact of his crash. Delgado prepared warm compresses by boiling water in military helmets, improvising body-warming techniques to counter the traumatic shock that afflicted many of the wounded after hours of exposure to the damp tropical climate. Hughes coordinated the night communications with growing skill, establishing contact with nearby medical units to exchange information on supplies and treatment methods adapted to the extreme conditions of the Philippine theater. The sticky nighttime mud had thickened with tropical dew, making movement even more treacherous and demanding extra caution when transporting the wounded between treatment stations. Carter watched the coordinated movement of his team and realized they were operating like a well-oiled life-saving machine, each member anticipating the other's needs in a synchronicity that transcended military training and entered the realm of shared intuition. The night promised to be long and challenging, but the medical team was ready to face any trial fate might bring in that mangrove-turned sanctuary of wartime medicine. The first nighttime emergency arrived in an improvised ambulance that had traveled 15 kilometers through territory partially controlled by the enemy, carrying 5 soldiers wounded in an ambush that had decimated a reconnaissance patrol, sent to assess Japanese defenses in Leyte's eastern hills. The most critical was a sergeant from Tennessee who had taken multiple machine gun rounds to the chest and abdomen, his labored breathing indicating a possible lung puncture that demanded immediate surgery to prevent fatal respiratory collapse. Carter moved at once to the main surgical table, his experienced hands rapidly assessing the extent of the wounds, while Delgado prepared instruments and anesthetics with the efficiency honed through days of practice in harsh conditions. The crack of isolated gunfire echoed through the surrounding jungle, a reminder that Japanese snipers were still active, and that the medical post remained vulnerable to direct attack that could halt life-saving operations. Reynolds sorted the other 4 casualties by severity, applying tourniquets and administering morphine, while maintaining constant communication with the evacuation teams, waiting in the rear to transport stabilized patients. The flickering glow of the kerosene lanterns cast dancing shadows that turned every movement into something theatrical and dramatic, a reminder that they were acting out a human drama, where each act determined whether young soldiers would return alive to their American families. Hughes had devised a coded communication system that allowed rescues to be coordinated, even when transmissions might be intercepted by the enemy, proving how necessity breeds creativity in extreme situations. The metallic gleam of surgical instruments shone under the golden lantern light, turning scalpels and forceps into sacred relics of a parallel war against death itself. Carter worked for 3 hours on the sergeant from Tennessee, removing bullets and repairing internal damage in a display of surgical skill that saved a life which had seemed lost when he first arrived at the emergency post. The night's most dramatic moment came when a precision Japanese bombardment struck the medical post directly, destroying 2 auxiliary tents and slightly wounding Reynolds, who was organizing supplies when the first shells exploded only meters away. The main blast created a 3-meter-wide crater exactly where the triage station had stood, destroying valuable equipment and scattering debris across the clearing that served as the field hospital. Carter continued operating on the wounded sergeant, even as grenade fragments rained down on the surgical tent, shielding the patient with his own body, while Delgado held the instruments and kept the operating field clean, despite the destructive chaos outside. The acrid smell of explosives mingled with the sweet scent of fresh blood, creating an atmosphere that overwhelmed the senses and tested the focus of even the most seasoned emergency medicine professionals. Reynolds ignored his own superficial wounds and immediately reorganized rescue operations, establishing new access routes that avoided the areas most exposed to enemy artillery fire, which had roughly pinpointed the medical post's location. Hughes kept communications running even after shrapnel pierced the radio equipment, improvising repairs with wire and scraps of metal that allowed continued coordination of evacuations and supply requests. The viscous mix of mud, blood, and debris created working conditions that would challenge even the most dedicated medical professionals, but no one hesitated to continue the rescue operations. Delgado organized a human chain to quickly move essential equipment to more protected areas, saving surgical instruments that would be crucial for the next emergency procedures. The medical team had shown that not even direct bombardment could interrupt their mission to save American lives, transforming themselves into living symbols of the determination that defined Allied forces in the Pacific theater. The response to the bombardment revealed the true scope of medical courage, when Carter decided to keep the post operational in the same location, despite the obvious risks, arguing that moving operations would cost the lives of patients who could not be transported during ongoing surgeries. Reynolds immediately supported the decision, volunteering to establish an improvised security perimeter that would give enough warning of new enemy attacks to protect patients and equipment. Delgado turned the wreckage of the destroyed tents into construction materials to reinforce the remaining structures, demonstrating the creativity that naturally emerges when dedicated professionals face seemingly insurmountable obstacles. Hughes expanded the communication system to include direct contact with American artillery units, setting up protocols that would allow a rapid response to future Japanese attempts to strike the medical post. The smell of charred wood mingled with the familiar odors of disinfectant and blood, creating a unique aroma that symbolized the resilience of military medicine against every force trying to halt the saving of American lives. The rough texture of the improvised sandbags contrasted with the softness of the clean bandages still being applied to the wounded, reminding everyone that protection and healing walked side by side in that forward station. Carter watched his team work with renewed determination after the bombardment and understood they were witnessing something extraordinary: the transformation of medical professionals into warriors of life who faced destruction armed with the tools of healing. Their decision to stay sent a clear message to the enemy. No earthly force could prevent American doctors from fulfilling their oath to preserve life, even if it meant confronting destruction head-on. The medical post had become a symbol of resistance that would inspire future generations of military professionals, proving that medical dedication could overcome even the most determined assaults on humanity in times of total war. The pre-dawn hours brought the team's most complex case when a young Navy lieutenant arrived with injuries requiring a 6-hour operation to repair, damage from a Japanese landmine that had exploded directly beneath his feet during a night patrol. Carter quickly assessed the situation and realized that saving the officer would demand surgical techniques that tested the limits of both his skill and the improvised equipment available in the field hospital. Delgado prepared an expanded surgical table from materials salvaged after the bombardment, creating an operating field that allowed full access to the complex wounds requiring simultaneous intervention on multiple organ systems. Reynolds organized a relay system to ensure a constant supply of blood, plasma, and anesthetics throughout the long operation, demonstrating logistical capabilities rivaling those of fully equipped hospitals. The smell of ether grew stronger as the anesthesia took effect, creating an atmosphere of absolute concentration that isolated the surgical team from the war still raging in the surrounding Philippine mangrove. Hughes established direct communication with medical specialists aboard hospital ships, obtaining technical guidance to complement the local expertise in what would become the most challenging operation ever attempted under active combat conditions. The delicate texture of exposed human tissue contrasted starkly with the roughness of the surrounding environment, a reminder that they were handling miracles of creation amid the most primitive destruction humanity could produce. Carter began the operation with steady hands and a determined heart, knowing that the next hours would decide not only the young officer's fate, but also set a precedent for what was possible in combat medicine. The medical team had accepted the ultimate challenge of their military careers, preparing to fight injuries that would test even the most experienced surgeons working in ideal civilian conditions. The success of the most complex operation ever performed in active combat conditions definitively established the Leyte Medical Post's reputation as a center of excellence where medical impossibilities were turned into victories of life over death. Carter worked through the entire night with almost supernatural concentration, removing metal fragments, repairing damaged blood vessels, and reconstructing torn tissue in a display of surgical skill that would impress even the best university hospitals. Delgado functioned as an extension of the surgeon's hands, anticipating each need and providing instruments and materials with clockwork precision that saved precious seconds in the race against potentially fatal complications. Reynolds maintained constant communication with the rear medical units, coordinating the delivery of rare blood plasma and specialized medications that were transported through hostile territory, specifically to save the young officer's life. Hughes documented every stage of the operation, creating records that would serve as study material for future generations of military doctors facing similar challenges in later conflicts. The scent of medical triumph mingled with the familiar smells of war, creating a unique atmosphere where civilization triumphed over barbarism through the application of knowledge and dedication in extreme circumstances. The soft texture of healing tissue contrasted with the roughness of the military environment, symbolizing the victory of human delicacy over the brutality of destructive forces. Carter completed the operation just as the sun rose over Leyte, illuminating the face of the young officer now breathing steadily. Another life pulled from death's grasp in that improvised hospital. The medical team had proven that there were no limits to what human dedication could achieve when directed toward preserving life, setting standards of excellence that would inspire medical professionals for generations to come in every conflict where humanity is forced to confront the forces of destruction. In a war where death falls from the sky like tropical rain, the true heroes are those who face the storms carrying umbrellas of compassion and surgical instruments turned into swords of life. Dawn on the fourth day brought word that a major Japanese counteroffensive was being prepared in the surrounding hills, meaning the forward aid station had to brace not only for rising waves of American wounded, but also the very real possibility of direct attacks against the medical facilities that had become symbols of American resistance in the late mangroves. Carter gathered his team to discuss emergency evacuation protocols, knowing that the decision to stay and keep saving lives or withdraw to preserve future medical capacity posed a moral dilemma that would test every principle guiding military medicine in active combat zones. Reynolds had established contact with reconnaissance units that confirmed significant Japanese troop movements during the night, suggesting coordinated attacks could begin at any moment against American positions deemed strategic by the enemy command. Delgado organized medical supplies into portable kits that would allow basic operations to continue, even if they were forced to abandon their fixed facilities, demonstrating the adaptability that defines experienced medical professionals in mobile warfare. The smell of aviation fuel mixed with the familiar sense of disinfectant and gunpowder, indicating that support aircraft were being positioned for possible evacuation of wounded and essential equipment. Hughes coordinated communications with mounting urgency, establishing emergency protocols that would maintain contact even during forced movements through hostile territory, where conventional communications could be cut by enemy action. The rough texture of combat uniforms contrasted with the gentleness of the hands still applying dressings, a reminder that war and healing remained intertwined, even as circumstances demanded preparation for a strategic withdrawal. Carter looked at each member of his team and recognized that they were facing the ultimate test of their medical convictions, the choice between personal safety and an absolute commitment to the oath to save American lives regardless of personal risk. The morning promised decisions that would determine not only the immediate fate of the medical operation, but would also set precedents for the limits of professional dedication, where survival itself was at stake. The first wave of casualties from the Japanese counteroffensive arrived in a devastating sequence that immediately stress-tested every protocol developed over the previous days of intensive operations under extreme adverse conditions. 7 military jeeps entered the clearing at once, carrying 16 American soldiers wounded in a series of coordinated attacks that had specifically targeted command and communications positions along the forward lines established during earlier offensives. Carter moved among the wounded with growing efficiency, rapidly assessing each case and setting priorities that would maximize collective survival, even when limited resources demanded morally crushing choices among patients equally in need of intensive medical care. The most critical was an artillery colonel struck by grenade shrapnel during a direct attack on the command post, his chest and abdominal injuries requiring immediate surgery that would compete with other urgent cases for the attention of an already stretched team. Delgado set up 3 simultaneous treatment stations, turning every available corner of the aid post into a miniature emergency room, where lives were saved with improvised equipment and techniques adapted to precarious conditions. Reynolds sprinted constantly between patients, administering advanced first aid, while coordinating new rescues for soldiers who kept arriving from forward lines where fierce combat continued non-stop. The sound of artillery had intensified dramatically, a constant background of explosions that made medical instruments tremble and strained the concentration needed for delicate procedures demanding absolute precision. Hughes coordinated evacuations with military efficiency, plotting safe routes that skirted areas under direct bombardment, while maintaining a steady flow of stabilized patients being transported to safer rear medical facilities. The sticky mix of blood and tropical mud created working conditions that would challenge medical professionals, even in perfectly equipped hospitals. But the team had developed techniques that overcame material limits through extreme dedication and creativity. The crucial decision point came when forward observers confirmed that a significant Japanese force was moving directly toward the aid station, with the evident intent to capture or destroy the facilities that had become symbols of America's ability to keep medical operations running under the worst conditions. Carter faced the hardest choice of his career when military commanders ordered an immediate evacuation, while he still had 6 patients in critical condition who could not survive transport without completing procedures that would require at least 2 more hours of intensive work. Reynolds immediately volunteered to remain with any team member who chose to stay, arguing that abandoning the wounded would betray the very principles that justified the American presence in the Philippines. Delgado backed the decision to continue, quickly organizing portable equipment that would allow treatment of the most severe cases, even if they were forced to work under still more precarious conditions during a possible siege. Hughes established direct communication with American artillery units, coordinating fire support that could slow the Japanese advance long enough to finish ongoing surgeries and organize a safe evacuation for all patients. The smell of gunpowder grew stronger as the explosions drew closer, creating an atmosphere of extreme urgency that frayed even the nerves of the most experienced combat medicine professionals. The metallic chill of surgical instruments felt colder in trembling hands racing against the clock, where every minute could mean the difference between life and death for multiple patients at once. Carter made the final decision to stay, declaring that doctors do not abandon patients regardless of circumstances, setting a precedent of courage that would inspire future generations of military professionals. The medical team chose to face maximum danger, to honor commitments that transcended personal safety, becoming living symbols of the dedication that represents the best of human nature in times of total war. The next 2 hours became combat medicine's ultimate trial, as the team worked to the rising din of gunfire and explosions that signaled the steady approach of Japanese forces determined to eliminate the forward post that had become a thorn in the enemy's strategy. Carter operated on the wounded colonel with near superhuman focus, ignoring rounds that whistled over the surgical tent while he removed shrapnel and repaired internal damage in a display of medical skill that defied every limitation imposed by extreme adversity. Delgado simultaneously managed treatment for 3 other critical patients, becoming a force multiplier that kept multiple life-saving operations running with human resources paired to the bare essentials. Reynolds set up an improvised defensive perimeter around the tents, coordinating with wounded soldiers who could still handle weapons to defend the facilities that represented their own best chance at survival. The smell of cordite mixed intensely with medical odors, creating a unique atmosphere where war and healing coexisted in a proximity that shattered all notions of separation between combat and medicine. Hughes maintained constant contact with supporting units, directing American artillery strikes that held the Japanese at just enough distance to finish the most urgent procedures. The viscous mix of sweat, blood, and mud pushed human endurance to its limits, yet no one hesitated to keep fighting for the lives entrusted to their care. Carter completed the colonel's surgery at the exact moment the first Japanese bullet struck medical equipment at the post's edge, but the officer was stabilized and ready for evacuation. The medical team had proven that professional dedication could overcome even the most direct threats to life, setting standards of courage that would redefine heroism in military medicine forever. The forward post had become a symbol of resistance, showing how humanity could triumph over barbarity, even when surrounded by forces determined to destroy everything representing civilization and compassion amid total war. The final evacuation became a masterpiece of medical-military coordination, when rescue helicopters arrived at the precise moment the last surgeries were completed, allowing the safe transport of every patient without losing a single life that had been saved during those dramatic hours. Carter personally oversaw the loading of each wounded man, ensuring that life support equipment continued functioning throughout the flight to hospital ships, where they would receive specialized care impossible to provide in the field. Reynolds was the last to board, carrying essential medical gear needed to establish a new forward post in a safer position, his devotion symbolizing military medicine's ongoing commitment to American soldiers. Delgado compiled detailed medical records to ensure continuity of care, documenting every procedure performed during the intense days that had turned a Philippine mangrove into a laboratory of medical innovation under extreme pressure. Hughes coordinated the final communication with commanders, who confirmed that all medical objectives had been achieved with exceptional success, exceeding the expectations of even the most optimistic observers. The smell of aviation fuel blended with familiar medical aromas, creating a transitional atmosphere that marked the close of an extraordinary chapter in the Pacific Theater's combat medicine history. The rough texture of the helicopter's military seats contrasted with the softness of the dressings, still covering treated wounds, a reminder that war and healing would remain intertwined even during strategic withdrawal. Carter watched the aid station being abandoned to the approaching Japanese forces and understood they were leaving behind not just equipment and facilities, but a legacy of courage that would inspire future generations of military medical professionals. The team had shown that commitment to human life can outweigh even the most direct threats to personal survival, setting precedents of heroism that would forever redefine standards of excellence in combat medicine. The Lady Forward Post had become a living legend, proving how humanity can overcome the forces of destruction when guided by principles that transcend personal safety in favor of preserving human life. When doctors choose to stay under enemy fire to complete surgeries that will save lives, they turn scalpels into swords of humanity and operating rooms into fortresses where civilization stands against barbarism. The new medical post was set up in a safer location 15 kilometers from the front lines, but the experience at Leyte had permanently transformed the team into an elite unit that would establish standards of excellence in combat medicine, influencing military operations for decades to come. Carter oversaw the installation of expanded facilities that incorporated lessons learned during those intense days in the mangrove, creating more efficient systems for triage, surgery, and evacuation that would maximize survival rates even in the most extreme situations. Reynolds organized improved rescue protocols that allowed retrieval of the wounded from hostile territory with greater safety and efficiency, developing techniques later taught in military schools as examples of courage and innovation under pressure. Delgado created training programs for new medical personnel arriving in the theater of operations, passing on practical knowledge not found in conventional military manuals, but often making the difference between life and death in real combat conditions. Hughes had fully recovered from his wounds and requested transfer to an infantry unit, but his experience as a patient turned him into a valuable consultant for improving communication between medical teams and wounded soldiers. The scent of new equipment mingled with the familiar aroma of disinfectant, creating an atmosphere that combined renewed hope with the hard-won experience of the Philippine battlefields. The soft feel of fresh bandages contrasted with the harsh memories of the days in the mangrove, a reminder that progress in military medicine was built on foundations of sacrifice and extreme dedication. Carter watched his team working with renewed confidence and realized they had become not just experienced medical professionals, but living symbols of how humanity can triumph over seemingly insurmountable adversity when guided by higher principles. The experience at Leyte had set precedents that would forever redefine expectations of what could be achieved in combat medicine, creating legacies to inspire future generations of military professionals facing similar challenges in later conflicts. Official recognition of the excellence demonstrated during the Leyte operations came in the form of military decorations honoring not only individual bravery, but also the collective importance of maintaining humanitarian standards even in the most brutal circumstances of modern war. Carter received the Distinguished Service Medal for leading medical operations that saved more than 50 American lives, under conditions that defied all conventions about the limits of field medicine, setting new standards of professional excellence under extreme pressure. Reynolds was awarded the Bronze Star for multiple acts of heroism while rescuing men under enemy fire, his quiet courage representing the finest American tradition of putting the welfare of comrades above personal safety. Delgado became the first nurse to receive special recognition for medical innovations developed in a combat zone, her improvised techniques officially incorporated into the U.S. Army's military medical protocols. Hughes was honored for his exceptional contributions as a patient who became an active member of the medical team, showing how wounded soldiers could continue to serve their comrades even while recovering. The scent of polished metals mingled with the aromas of military hospitals, creating a solemn atmosphere that honored the sacrifices of professionals who chose to face death in order to preserve life. The cold feel of the metal decorations contrasted with the warmth of memories of lives saved, reminding everyone that the true rewards of military medicine lay not in official recognition, but in the satisfaction of having fulfilled professional oaths under the most challenging conditions. Carter spoke on behalf of the team, emphasizing that individual honors represented collective acknowledgement of all medical professionals who served silently in combat zones around the world. These official decorations validated the importance of military medicine as an essential component of America's combat capability, demonstrating that saving lives was as crucial as winning battles in achieving global strategic objectives. The lasting influence of the WWII operations manifested itself in permanent changes to U.S. military medical protocols, which incorporated the techniques and procedures developed during those intense days in the Philippine mangroves. Military medical schools established specialized curricula based on Carter's team's experience, teaching future generations of professionals how to maintain standards of excellence even when material resources were scarce and working conditions challenged traditional medical conventions. Reynolds wrote combat rescue manuals that became required reading for all medical units deployed in active war zones, his techniques saving countless American lives in subsequent conflicts around the world. Delgado launched training programs for military nurses that emphasized adaptability and creativity as essential traits for success in field medicine. Her innovations influenced civilian medical practices and benefited entire populations. Hughes became a national spokesperson for wounded veterans, using his experience to improve communication between medical professionals and patients in traumatic situations, requiring a deep understanding of psychological as well as physical needs. The scent of fresh ink in medical manuals mingled with the aromas of military classrooms, creating an atmosphere of learning that carried forward lessons forged through sacrifice and extreme dedication in real combat. The smooth pages of new protocols contrasted with the rough memories of days in the mangrove, reminding everyone that military medical knowledge was built on the practical experience of situations where theory and reality often diverged dramatically. Carter personally supervised the implementation of new standards to ensure that future medical teams would be better prepared to face similar challenges, his experience at WWII becoming a template for excellence in combat medicine. The innovations developed during the Philippine operations influenced not only American military medicine, but also set international precedents that improved medical care in war zones worldwide, proving how individual courage could yield collective benefits that transcended national and temporal boundaries. The reunion of the WWII medical team 5 years after the war revealed how those intense days in the Philippine mangroves had permanently shaped the lives and careers of every member who had taken part in the historic rescue operations under enemy fire. Carter had become director of emergency medicine at a veterans hospital in Chicago, applying techniques developed in combat to save civilian lives in trauma situations that echoed the extreme conditions faced in the Pacific War. Reynolds established a specialized rescue medicine school training professionals to work in natural disasters and conflict zones, his methods adopted by international humanitarian organizations operating in the world's harshest conditions. Delgado became national supervisor of military nursing, developing programs that prepared women to serve in direct combat roles previously reserved for men. Hughes returned to his farm in Iowa, but maintained active correspondence with veterans' hospitals, offering the unique perspective of a patient who had experienced both the horrors of wartime injuries and the miracles of dedicated combat medicine. The smell of coffee shared during the reunion mingled with the aromas of memories that remained vivid despite years of civilian life, creating a nostalgic atmosphere that celebrated bonds forged under extreme pressure. The soft feel of old photographs contrasted with the firmness of hands still bearing the scars of those intense days, a reminder that some experiences mark those who live them forever. Carter looked at each member of his former team and understood that Lady had created not just experienced medical professionals, but a military family bound by shared experiences that transcended conventional professional relationships. The reunion confirmed that the values demonstrated during the Philippine operations continued to shape their lives and careers, perpetuating legacies of excellence and dedication that would inspire future generations of military medical professionals. The final historical impact of the Leyte medical operations took shape through monuments and memorials, honoring not only the soldiers who fought and died in the Philippines, but also the medical professionals who risked their lives to save wounded comrades in conditions that tested every limit of human endurance and dedication. The National Military Medicine Memorial in Washington incorporated a special section dedicated to the Leyte operations, displaying original equipment used by Carter's team, alongside testimonies from soldiers whose lives had been saved during those dramatic days in the mangroves. Medical universities established scholarships in the names of the Leyte professionals, funding trauma medicine research that continued to advance life-saving techniques first developed in the crucible of extreme combat. Military museums around the world included exhibits on the Philippine operations as examples of how medicine and war could coexist in a way that honored both military efficiency and fundamental humanitarian values. Historical documentaries preserved the accounts of veterans treated at the aid station, their personal stories demonstrating the lasting impact of decisions made by medical professionals under extreme pressure. The scent of polished bronze at the memorials mingled with the fragrance of fresh flowers placed by grateful families, creating an atmosphere of reverence that honored the sacrifices of those who chose to face death to preserve life. The cold marble of the monuments contrasted with the warmth of the memories preserved, reminding all that true legacies reside not in physical structures, but in the lives transformed through acts of courage and dedication. Carter, now elderly, visited the memorials regularly, watching young military doctors study the techniques developed at Leyte, and recognizing that those intense days had created traditions that would continue to inspire professionals for generations to come. The Leyte medical operations had become a legend, proving how ordinary individuals can accomplish extraordinary feats when guided by principles that place the well-being of others above personal considerations, setting standards of heroism that would forever redefine concepts of courage in military medicine. The final legacy of the Philippine operations lay in the demonstration that humanity can triumph over barbarism even in the harshest circumstances. When dedicated professionals choose to honor oaths that transcend fear and personal limitation in the service of preserving human life. The true heroes of war are not only those who wield weapons against the enemy, but those who wield instruments of healing against death, turning battlefields into sanctuaries where humanity celebrates its greatest victories over the forces of destruction. Decades later, when military historians analyzed the factors that contributed to the American victory in the Pacific, they invariably mention not only industrial and strategic superiority, but also the extraordinary dedication of medical professionals who sustained troop morale through care that demonstrated the value the American nation placed on the life of each individual soldier. The Leyte medical operations became case studies in military schools around the world, exemplifying how efficient combat medicine is an essential component of modern military capability. Carter, Reynolds, Delgado, and Hughes had proved that courage is found not only in facing the enemy with weapons, but in facing death with instruments of healing. establishing legacies of heroism that would inspire future generations of military medical professionals in every conflict where humanity must resist forces seeking to destroy all that represents civilization and compassion.